Hey freshmen, coming at you on a Monday night. Going to record my video lecture for today, and we're going to jump up to Northern Africa today. Looking forward to it. I have my friend Captain America who has joined us. Also, I don't know if you can see her in the background. Petronella is joining us from the back. She's in trouble. No, I'm kidding. Then I also wanted to show you what I discovered today in my son's room. He's been holding out on me. He has this beautiful, wonderful cup of the countries of, or the continents of the whole world, including Africa. Can you see that? Told him that I wanted it, but he wouldn't give it to me because he said that he got it from a friend. So anyway, we are going to go to North Africa today. After our discussion about Western Africa last go around. And it's actually a pretty lengthy lesson, so I'm going to try to go through it pretty quickly with you all. This will be our last lesson on Africa. We will have on Thursday, we're going to have a quiz over all of our information on Africa. It'll cover a lot of the material that I normally would cover on a test, but it's going to be modified a little bit. Since we're in these circumstances that we're in. And then a week from tomorrow, we're going to do the Africa map test. And that will go into RunWeb as a test grade. So stay tuned for more information. I probably will email you another copy of the practice map this evening. I meant to do that this weekend and I just didn't do it. So I'm gonna put my glasses on, gonna jump into my material. I have lots of fun stories for you today. All right. Let's go to the top here. Okay, so again, just as you are going over the lesson, I would watch the lecture while you're looking at the PowerPoint. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, video clips excuse me, that I want you to watch. And it indicates on the PowerPoint where those videos, when you should watch them to kind of make sense with the lesson, as if we were in class and I was showing them myself. And then a few backstories that you can't find in your book. Just general information that I find fascinating. Actually, the northern part of Africa, I feel like I have a little bit more concept of, a little bit more biblical history related to Northern Africa, especially in Egypt, and historical information like the pirates from Tunisia, the Barbary pirates that Thomas Jefferson fought against, and then the Rock of Gibraltar, and just a whole lot of things. And so we'll end up talking a little bit again about Islam because North Africa was dominated by Islam for a very long time. So the United Nations, the United Nations designations of areas of the continent of Africa for the northern part of Africa are very similar to what the book addresses as the countries of Northern Africa, with the exception of Sudan. In the United Nations territories, they include Sudan and Northern Africa. So we've already talked about the Sudan when we were talking about Eastern Africa. So today we're going to be talking about Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. And hopefully you finished your homework assignment, which was to put together a fact of the day over the pyramids of Egypt. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about that as well myself. So I'm going to jump down to the first PowerPoint that says homework assignment, fact of the day, the pyramids of Egypt. It's actually the 1, 2, 3, 4th PowerPoint slide. I have some of my own pictures in here. I looked real briefly to see if you guys had been turning yours in. They're not technically due till tomorrow. So I don't have my information in front of me, but it looked like you guys were doing good with the Google Slides. I am fascinated by the pyramids. One of the pictures that you will see in my PowerPoint is a picture of the pyramids of Giza, which are outside of Cairo. And when you see pictures of them on the internet, it looks like they are out in the middle of the desert, out in the middle of nowhere. And in reality, they almost buttress right up against the city of Cairo to one side, and then a little way off is the Nile River. And so it gives you a completely different perspective as a tourist what you would be going to see. You literally would probably be getting out of your Uber or your taxi cab and walking up to a man with a camel and being solicited for all the touristy things, paying high dollars to go walk on the stones of the pyramids at Giza. So I think you'll enjoy that picture. There's also an image that shows you what it would have looked like back in its time, where the Nile River was at the time that the pyramids of Giza were built. Kind of a neat picture. And then probably my favorite picture of the pyramid is one that was taken at the either during World War I or at the end of World War I. And a number of British soldiers and Indian soldiers are sitting on the stones of the pyramid. And the picture, it's a black and white picture. It gives you a perspective of how completely massive these pyramids actually were. As you know, they were primarily built to be tombs for the pharaohs, their wives, their children, some of the priests. The Valley of the Kings was a complex that actually was underground for the most part. They had all kinds of problems with thievery. People would, over the centuries, and decades would go through those areas, and they would just, break into the pyramids and steal all of those beautiful items that the people were buried with, because they thought they would be taking them into their next life. And so most of the pyramids, by the time in the modern era when we had a chance to excavate them, usually a lot of the stuff was gone. However, not always. As you know, there's all kinds of mummies that have been unearthed and uncovered and investigated and studied by scientists. Just probably, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. One of the videos I'm going to have you watch is actually from just a few months ago. There was a huge unearthing of numbers of wooden coffins that probably contained the mummies, the mummified bodies of priests that served possibly the pharaohs, and it's kind of interesting. If you ever have a chance to go to Kansas City Art Institute, Nelson Art Gallery in Kansas City, not the Art Institute, but the museum itself, the Nelson Atkins Art Museum. They have a phenomenal Egyptian collection, and they have a number of mummies, and it's absolutely fascinating. So if you ever have a chance to go there, I strongly recommend that you do. So you will notice that there are two different PowerPoint slides that have video or film picture, or a picture of a film strip on them. The first one is in front of a pyramid, and it will tell you which one to watch. The second one is a picture of mummies. And so there are two separate videos that I want you to watch related to the pyramids of Egypt. So, and I look forward to reading your facts of the day. All right, so I'm going to peek again at my slide here. Okay, so the first set of notes, and again, I would encourage you to print off the notes and the definitions. Anything that has text on them in the PowerPoint, I would print off those slides and use that as a means to take notes while you are listening to my lecture, because I'm going to be talking about things that may or may not specifically be spelled out in these PowerPoints that you need to know. I'm not just talking to talk, so I would definitely do that. I would encourage you to do that. The first notes slide says North Africa's physical features, and there are a number of things, physical features that dominate North Africa. The western, if you'll notice, and you guys probably noticed this, but there's an area on the western part of North Africa that says, sometimes it says unclaimed territory, sometimes it says Western Sahara. Essentially, that block of land in between Mauritania and Morocco that borders the Atlantic Ocean has been in dispute for a number of years. Right now, Morocco controls about 80% of it. They actually claim it all as their territory. Mauritania had a portion of it for years, but they just finally kind of threw their hands up and didn't want to mess with it anymore. There's an ethnic group that lives there. They want their independence, but Morocco doesn't want to give up the land. And so there's been civil war and civil unrest, but for the last few, probably, I'm going to say 2 decades or so, there's been relative calm. Morocco has a firm hold of about 80% of it, and they just kind of let the natives or the ethnic minority there kind of do their thing. But most of it is the Sahara Desert, so it's a pretty barren land. That is known as the Western Sahara. I generally don't have you label it on your map. Haven't decided if I'm going to have you label it, but I do want you to be familiar with what it is. Let's see here. The Atlas Mountains are another specific important area of northern Africa, and it is along the western rim of Morocco and into Algeria. In fact, when we watched the Bear Grylls episode where he was dropped from a helicopter into the Sahara Desert and where he killed the snake, that area was near the Atlas Mountains, and he was visiting with a member of the Berber ethnic minority. The Berbers used to live in that area all along North Africa, and then the Muslim Arabs came in, and so a lot of people still speak Berber. There's a lot of cultural heritage there. But they do not have their own homeland per se, and a lot of them live in the Atlas Mountains as Bedouins. Let's see here. So the Sahara Desert obviously is an important feature in North Africa. The Sahara Desert kind of pushes its way almost all the way to the top of North Africa, and then all along the rim of North Africa you have a Mediterranean climate because of the Mediterranean Ocean. Lots of moisture coming off of the oceans there. The temperatures are milder. There's lots of cities and populations are along that northern edge, but the Sahara Desert is not that far away. So the Sahara Desert butts up against that Mediterranean climate along the west or the northern part of the continent. Let's see here. The Mediterranean coastline, of course, is where most of the population areas of North Africa are. There's a whole bunch of cities sprinkled all along the Mediterranean coast there, all the way from Casablanca in Morocco, up to Benghazi, Libya, where we'll talk about that in a second, where our American consulate was attacked, over to Alexandria, Egypt, which is a historic city known for its centers of learning and libraries and that sort of thing, named after Alexander the Great. Cairo, Egypt. And then eventually, if you keep going, you're going to run into Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Beirut, Lebanon. So all of the population centers are sprinkled across the northern part of the continent of Africa. Let's see what else. Of course, the Nile River system on the eastern part of North Africa. The Nile River dumps into the Mediterranean Sea on the eastern corner of northern part of Egypt. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. The people of South America dispute that a little bit and suggest that perhaps the Amazon River is longer, but probably the Nile River is a little bit longer. It depends on how you measure tributaries and that sort of thing. The Amazon is the largest by volume, but the Nile River is the longest. And the Blue Nile and the White Nile feed into the Nile River down in Sudan and eventually make their way to the Delta area in the northern part of Egypt and dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. And that's obviously a huge significant part of history. Our history as Christians, when you think about Moses and Pharaoh and the battles that they got that were around the Nile River, whether it was Moses turning the river to blood or the frogs and all that stuff. So, excuse me, I'm supposed to cough into my arm, aren't I? I'm not sick, by the way. Let's see here. And then lastly, another physical feature of North Africa that I want you to be familiar with is the little peninsula called the Sinai Peninsula. And if you look on your map that I have on this particular slide, where Egypt is, Egypt looks like, it looks like sort of like this. You can't see it on here. It looks like a cup. And then right here, there's a little tiny triangle that sticks out on the eastern side of Egypt right here in between Israel and Egypt. And that peninsula right there is where the Suez Canal and the Red Sea kind of merge together. And then this is the Red Sea right here. Okay. And so this area up here is probably where the Jewish people crossed over into away from Egypt towards the Promised Land. And when you look at the map, just take a look at that. It looks like a little triangle. It's a little peninsula. It's a really barren, desert, rocky, mountainous area. Not a lot of people live there. Unfortunately, if I understand correctly, that's where a lot of the weapons are smuggled into the Gaza Strip that eventually impact Israel. So the Egyptians don't have much control of that area. A lot of gun running, from what I understand. Okay, the next PowerPoint slide is just a definition. It's hieroglyphics, and most of us know what hieroglyphics are. They eventually became known as hieroglyphs, and they are images and patterns that the Egyptians used to commemorate or represent words and sounds. And it took a long time to figure out the Egyptian language. It was a written language, and it was perfected over the years. But what we're most familiar with seeing are those images of things, dogs and people, and pieces of pottery or everyday common items, and they would use those images to communicate messages. Eventually, those symbols began to represent sounds and then a written language. And so, the definition says hieroglyphics are a writing system used in ancient Egypt in which pictorial characters represented words and sounds. Fast forward centuries later, there was a stone called the Rosetta Stone that was discovered, and that had the same message in 3 different languages. And so one of those languages was Greek. And so we could understand Greek. And so using the Greek language, we were able to figure out what those symbols and slashes and pictures and stuff meant in the hieroglyphics, and we were finally able to translate it. I forgot, I was going to look and see what year that was, but I forgot to do that. So you've heard of the Rosetta Stone learning language program, and that's kind of the background on what the true Rosetta Stone is. So the first PowerPoint slide is a slide on Egypt. Egypt has it is a country of massive biblical proportion, and the stories of Egypt are told fluently throughout the Bible. And there's a lot of historical significance, but as Christians, the country of Egypt is evidence of Scripture in a lot of ways. The historical record of Egypt backs up the historical record of the Bible. I had a professor once, or a teacher once, tell me, a fellow teacher, I was trying to figure out when the pyramids at Giza were built and how they configured into the timetable that creationists say that the earth is about between 6 and 10,000 years old. And I couldn't quite figure it out. I was doing the numbers and trying to figure out the years, and this professor suggested that the pyramids of Giza actually survived the worldwide flood. I mean, they're massive. They're millions and millions and millions of tons in weight. I suppose they could have survived the flood rather than being, toppled in the flood. But if you do the numbers and you do the math, the Egyptian empires correlate with the biblical record as well. And so I'm just going to go through some of the things that I think you've probably heard these stories before. You're like, oh, I forgot that was Egypt. So let me go ahead and go through these. All right, so this is really, really cool. And this is a study of words. Again, it's evidence of the biblical story of history and how accurate the Bible is. But if you were to travel throughout Egypt, Egypt calls itself the land of Misr, M-I-S-R. Misr means Mizraim, which is the name of Noah's grandson. And the Bible says that he calls Egypt the land of Ham. Ham happens to be Mizraim's dad, Noah's son. So Mizraim is the grandson of Noah. Ham is Noah's son who had Mizraim. And all over Egypt today, their banks, their government buildings are named M-I-S-R, which again translates into Mizraim, which is just fascinating to me that they still hold on to the language that is biblical. They don't realize that, but it's biblical. In Genesis 10:6, it refers to loosely that Mizraim is the father of the Egyptians. I don't know exactly. It mentions that Mizraim is a grandson or the son of Ham, and that Ham is called the land of Egypt. So I think in the Psalms it's referred to that. Let's see here. Of course, we all know the story of when Abraham was called out of the city of Ur to go to this land that God was giving him. He made his way towards the promised land and found himself into a difficult situation with Pharaoh. It says that Pharaoh found Sarai beautiful, and so Abraham told Sarai to tell Pharaoh that she was Abraham's sister, and not his wife, so that Abram wouldn't get killed by Pharaoh. And so she did what Abraham asked her to do. And Pharaoh suddenly had all these terrible things happening in his life when he brought her into his harem. And when he discovered the truth that she was indeed the wife of another man, he was very upset with Abram and says, "Why didn't you tell me the truth? Your God could have punished me for taking another man's wife." And so we see probably the oldest of the Egyptian pharaohs in the earliest part of their kingdom, all the way back in the story of Abraham, because Abraham was only, I think, 3 generations removed from the flood. So we see the story of Egypt beginning all the way back there. Let's see what else. Of course, Moses. We know the story of Moses, and so eventually the brothers, Joseph was sent into slavery. His brothers came once he was leading. He was a prince of Egypt, and he saved them from famine. And the Jewish people, the Hebrew people grew, and it began to threaten the new Pharaoh. And so he asked the midwives to kill the children, the Hebrew children, the boys that were born, and they refused. And ultimately, you know the story, Moses gets put in a basket to protect him, and he's raised in Pharaoh's household. And so we know the plagues and the whole story of the Hebrew people leaving Egypt, and how God destroyed Pharaoh and his armies by covering them over with water in the Red Sea. So again, Egypt. If you move on through the Bible, there are several instances where the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel made alliances with the various kingdoms of Egypt to protect themselves against whether it be the Assyrians or the Babylonians. Ultimately, I think it was Jehoiakim, who was a puppet ruler in Judah, the southern kingdom, that decided to basically disregard Nebuchadnezzar's threat, and he made an alliance with one of the very last pharaohs, and Nebuchadnezzar came in and just pummeled Jerusalem, leveled the temple. The Bible says that Jeremiah the prophet, who had been warning the kings of Israel that God was going to bring punishment on them, it says that even Jeremiah, I believe, fled to Egypt for protection. Of course, you guys also know that Jesus and Joseph and Mary fled Herod and went to Egypt and sought refuge in Egypt until it was safe for them to return to Israel. And so Egypt's all over the Bible, which I think is really cool. So let's see here. A few other things about the history of Egypt. Eventually, the Macedonians and Alexander the Great conquered the kingdom, the very weakened kingdom of Egypt. The empire of Egypt, through all of its different pharaohs, lasted for about 3,000 years. So they were a very powerful and old empire in that part of the world. Alexander the Great established the city of Alexandria in his name. It was a center of learning, Greek learning, and brought people to this kind of new, it brought Europeans and Greeks and Italians and the Latins, the Romans eventually to that part of the world. When Alexander the Great died, I think it was one of his generals, Ptolemy, set him up as a puppet king, or he was set up as a puppet king in the land of Egypt, and he took on the role of Pharaoh. And so you have this whole era of Ptolemy rule that was really Greek rule, but they continued to serve as Egyptian rulers, and pharaohs dressed like them, did all of the spiritual, weird voodoo, mummification, mysticism, worshiping them as gods. And this is where the story gets kind of interesting. And I know you guys have heard of Cleopatra. Very common name and expression, although most of us don't know the story behind Cleopatra. So I want to set the stage for you. There's some images of Cleopatra in the PowerPoint. She's been portrayed in a whole bunch of different ways, everywhere from Rihanna to Angelina Jolie have portrayed her, Elizabeth Taylor back in the decades ago in the movies. But Cleopatra was, she was a Ptolemy ruler. She was actually Greek. She wasn't Egyptian, but you wouldn't know that because for successive generations, her family has sat on this throne. And so she and her brother were married, which is gross, but it was just a kind of in figuratively, and they co-reigned. And I don't know if it was because she was a girl, she couldn't reign by herself, I'm not sure. But she was very seductive, very powerful, very politically savvy, and she began to have an affair with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was just a lifetime removed from the birth of Christ. So I think Julius Caesar was assassinated in around 35 BC, so about 35 years before Jesus was born. Julius Caesar was the emperor of the Roman Empire, and he began an illicit relationship with her, and she had a child by him, and she named him something like Caesarea Ptolemy or something along those lines. And so effectively making potentially Julius Caesar's offspring the future dynasty of Egypt. And as you guys probably know, the story goes, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate. He was stabbed like 23, 24, 25 times by the senators, and which set up kind of political disunity in the Roman Empire, and the various generals began to kind of vie for power in the Roman Empire. And Cleopatra, again, was no dummy. She wanted to make sure she was on the right side of history, and so she began a relationship with one of the generals named Mark Antony. And Mark Antony was smitten by her as well. He visited her frequently, and I would say that the important people in the Roman sphere were not necessarily happy about this. There were two other generals, but the other one that matters is one by the name of Octavius. Now, Octavius is going to take on a new name when he becomes emperor, but Octavius was not happy with Mark Antony and wanted to get rid of him as a threat to the throne, to becoming the Caesar. And so he knew that Mark Antony was hanging out with Cleopatra down in Egypt, and so he went after him. When Cleopatra realized that Mark Antony was going to die and there was nothing that she could do about it, no matter how seductive she was, she tried to use all the ploys that she'd always used before, but Octavius wasn't taking it. He wasn't taking the bait, and so eventually Octavius came into Egypt. And upon hearing about this, Cleopatra decided that she was going to kill herself. She was 39 years old, and she went to her tomb, her pyramid-like tomb, and her royal tomb, and she brought in her staff with her, and she sent a note to Mark Antony, who was fierce in battle, and said, "I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to commit suicide because I love you and I can't live without you, and you're going to die, and I can't live without you." And so Mark Antony, upon hearing about her possible suicide, killed himself. He took his own knife out and he put his dagger into his gut and he killed himself. And so when Octavius discovered this, he essentially tried to lure Cleopatra. He wanted to actually banish her to the Roman province up in Italy, and she did not want to be paraded as a victor. She really thought he was going to kill her, but when she heard that Octavius was going to have her banished and take away all of her power, she decided she was not happy about that. And so under the nose of Octavius, she and her maids and servants that worked with her all probably took some sort of poison from a snake. There were no wounds on her. They couldn't figure out how she died, except that she had written that she was going to take viper's poison, and there were 2 puncture wounds on her arm, and they weren't snake bites, but it looked like they had somehow injected the poison into her and her maids, and they all died. And so Octavius then essentially becomes the new emperor of the Roman Empire, and he takes on a new name, and his name is Caesar Augustus. Now, Caesar Augustus is the Caesar, the Roman emperor, who called for a census that all men in Judea should go to the place of their birth and register for the Roman Empire, fulfilling scripture that took Joseph and Mary from the little town of Nazareth to Bethlehem to register, where the Messiah was prophesied to be born. And so even this crazy Octavius and the story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, this love story, is all intertwined in this coming Messiah and the fulfillment of prophecy. So cool. So anyway, I was reading about that today and I just found that fascinating. Sounds like a little bit like a Romeo and Juliet with all of the killing and all of that. But fascinating story. Check out those images of Cleopatra. I tried to find a video to show you kind of a summary of this, but because she was such a seductress, I had a hard time finding anything that I thought your parents wouldn't get upset about. So anyway, I've just told you the story. So let's see here. So you can take a look at all of these different images of Cleopatra. The pictures of the two gentlemen in the bottom, one of them is Julius Caesar. He's the one that's wearing the Roman leaves around his head. And the other one represents Mark Antony. Let's see here. Okay. And then last slide about Egypt just really talks about the history of Egypt and Egypt today. So Muhammad was born in 600-ish AD, after 600 years after the birth of Christ, and Islam swept across the northern part of Africa. And most at that time, they conquered in war and battle. Essentially, you converted or you died or you were outcast. And so Islam took over most of North Africa, and they controlled North Africa for centuries, even moving into Europe through Spain. Let's see here. Eventually, in about 1800, Europe began to colonize parts of Africa, which also included North Africa. Egypt itself was actually colonized by the English, by the British. Many educated people in Egypt go outside of the country to get their degrees and to get their education, their higher education, college, university. And most of the government officials and the more well-to-do Egyptians actually speak English. Back in 1860-ish, there was a very important canal built called the Suez Canal. It connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. I didn't look to see how many miles it is, but I'm going to just go out on a limb, maybe 35 miles. It is actually a critical national security canal for America today because it allows us to move our ships from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea rather than having to go all the way around the coast of South Africa. However, it's very costly. Every ship that goes through the Suez Canal pays, on average, a minimum of $150,000. So if we send a fleet of ships through there, we're spending millions of dollars every time we move our ships from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, for instance. And so that's a large way that Egypt makes money. And I want you to find the Suez Canal on the map when you're looking at it. Egypt gained its independence from the British in 1953 after World War II. And they they call themselves a republic. They have a constitution and they have elected leaders, but really it's more for appearances. They've been ruled by military generals, by presidents who get elected over and over and over again and rule with an iron fist. Their idea of republicanism is not what we have in the United States. Some have been successful, some have not been successful. In 1979, a Egyptian president named Menachem Begin, I actually remember him, this is so weird. Egypt historically fought against Israel with the other Arab nations, but this particular leader decided he didn't want to be enemies with Israel anymore. And so in a bold strike, Menachem Begin, I think I'm saying that right, signed a peace accord with Israel in 1979, and it shocked the Arab world. But it's created stability in a region that needed a great amount of stability. And unfortunately for him, it cost him his life. A radical Muslim shot and killed him because he was unhappy that this leader, this Arab leader, this Muslim leader would sign a peace treaty with Israel. Since that time, Egypt has been ruled by a man by the name of his President Mubarak. And I grew up remembering him, knowing him as the president of Egypt. He ruled for almost 35 years or so. And he could be a dictator of sorts. He also was Western thinking, Western educated, I believe. And so he tried to make nicey nice, but the people of Egypt suffered under him. And during the 2011 Arab Spring, when Syria began to fall apart, Mr. Mubarak was deposed, thrown in prison, tried on all kinds of charges, but ultimately he was released, and he just passed away of natural causes at his home just a few months ago. But he was one of the casualties of the 2011 Arab Spring, when many Arab countries around the world began to cry and shout and scream for more freedom and the right to vote and more transparency in their government. It's the same Arab Spring that started in Syria, that began the Syrian conflict that we're still dealing with. Remember when we talked about Syria and we talked about the children who were protesting, and the government arrested them for spraying graffiti, ended up killing some of them, which led to just further outrage and using the military to squash the protesters. So this was all part of this, what historians call the Arab Spring. There was another man in Libya, the dictator of Libya, whose name was, oh, I can't remember his name. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yes, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. He was a cruel, terrible dictator. He was also deposed during the same Arab Spring, but he was unlucky. He was the unlucky of the three of them. When his enemies discovered him in hiding, they took him and they drug him through the city, basically killing him, shredding him, and then paraded him around Libya. And Libya hasn't been the same since. There's also some pictures in here right before that, the pictures of those dictators of the Suez Canal and some of our ships going through those canals. Pretty fascinating. All right. Okay, and then I've put together Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria together. And they are, again, they're couched in between Egypt and Morocco, and so they're in the center part of North Africa. They have had all kinds of political instability, lots of influence from radical Islam, lots of terrorism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood, you name it, they've had issues. If you look at the flags that are on this PowerPoint, each of them has the crescent moon and a star. So in solidarity with that Islamic heritage. All three of them are also huge oil exporting countries. That's how they make their money. They're all very conservative Islamic countries, and so I don't know that they practice Sharia law to the extent that Saudi Arabia does, but they have a very strict interpretation of Islam. Probably the one thing you might be familiar with Libya is in 2012, on the 11th anniversary of the September 11 attacks, our United States consulate in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked in a coordinated effort over a period of 13 hours, I believe it was. And unfortunately, the United States ambassador, Christopher Stevens, was killed. It was the first time, I think, in 35 years, something like that, that an ambassador to the United States lost their lives in the line of duty. Three other men also lost their lives, one of the tech guys that worked at the consulate, as well as some CIA members. One of them, I think, was a former Navy SEAL who came to the defense of the consulate. There were about 30 other Americans working in the consulate that were scared for their lives. RPG rounds were coming in. The attack was a mob of people, and it went on for hours and hours and hours. It was essentially the Obama administration, under the direction of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, did not respond in the way you would expect. In fact, seemed like they were almost silent. There were no drones with weapons sent in. There were no aircrafts that were weaponized that went in to break up the situation. And unfortunately, two of the four people that lost their lives at the end of that 13-hour period, trying to hold off the crowds from attacking the 30 Americans they were protecting within their own building. So there are some images here of the evening of the attack, and then the aftermath, and there's pictures of the gentlemen that lost their lives. And then I do want you to watch about a 10-minute video clip. I think it was CBS or CNN, I can't remember which. It's just a very, very short overview of what happened that night. And there's been books written about it, movies made about it. I actually saw the movie 13 Hours. It was really hard to watch. It's one of those movies that you feel like you need to watch, but it was really hard to watch. And I'd say there's still more questions than there are answers. I don't know that the families of the guys that died have ever gotten the answers fully. But that is the way the government operates. And so why was there a CIA annex there? What were they doing there? We still don't know for sure. We suspect they were involved in smuggling weapons to Syrian rebel forces, but we don't know for sure. So maybe we don't want to know. All right. And then lastly, Morocco. Morocco is a beautiful country on the western coast of Africa. It's got the Atlas Mountains, the Atlantic Ocean. It's probably the most stable of all of the North African countries. It's not quite such a conservative. It is conservative, but not in the vein of Egypt and some of those other countries. In fact, there was so much trouble with Islamic clerics coming out of the schools in Saudi Arabia where they all go to get trained that Morocco started its own universities to train imams to become pastors in Islam, and they got weary of struggling against this radical Islam, and so they decided they would train their own imams. Some of the places that it's a French colony, so most of the people in Morocco speak French. There are still some French citizens that live there. It's very stable. It's very influential member state of North Africa and the Arab Union and the United Nations. They are a constitutional monarchy, so they have a king. There's a picture of him here. But effectively, the parliament is elected. They have elected officials. I believe that women have more rights in that Arab country, Muslim country, than most in the Middle East. And let's see here. One of the largest cities is a city called Casablanca. And if you're an old movie buff, there was a movie called Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart. Very, very famous. I've got a picture of it there. Lots of beautiful places to visit in Morocco. Again, it's a very safe place to travel. In fact, let's see here. Riley Roberts, who graduated from Lifeway, whose mom, Carolyn, used to work in the office. She did a semester abroad in Morocco, and she met another student from America in her program, and they are now engaged. So she had to go to Morocco to meet her future husband, but he's American. But anyway, there's a city there called I don't know if it's translated to the Blue City, but it's just gorgeous. Lots of beautiful cities, lots of beautiful sights to see, lots of beautiful coastline. Got to go to Casablanca, of course. And then one of the most interesting features of Morocco is on the northern border is the Strait of Gibraltar, which is a narrow waterway that goes from the Atlantic Ocean into the Mediterranean Sea, or you could say the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean. It is what separates the continent of Europe from Africa. It's only 7 or 8 miles wide. In Gibraltar, or the Rock of Gibraltar, Gibraltar is an actual province on this island, and this rock just juts up out of the water. It's crazy. It's on the tip. I think it's actually on the European side, but you can see the pictures of it here. Take a look at those. American naval ships, all ships that go into the Mediterranean have to pass through there. So it's a very actually security, very critical location for world security because of all of the shipping that has to come and go through the Strait of Gibraltar. So there's even an airport on the rock. I had a friend or acquaintance that served in the Navy, and he said it was just so cool when the Navy ships, everyone would come up to the top, the surface, and they would, as they sailed through there, they wanted to see the rock coming up out of the water and to be able to say, that's Africa and that is Europe. Just a really cool experience. Okay, I think I got through the lesson. I'm almost on 45 minutes on the lecture. I'm sorry that you have to sit here and listen to me for that long. Hopefully, breaking up and watching the video clips that I mentioned. There is one final video that I want you to watch, and it is a Morocco tourism video. It's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7 minutes long. It's not too long. The top 10 things you should see in Morocco. I don't think it will disappoint you. The locations and the sites that they show are just beautiful, and it's a side of North Africa that is very, very unique and colonial and almost familiar. It feels like a Greek islandy parts of it anyway, flavor to it. So, and then the last PowerPoint slide says, okay, homework for Thursday. You have a quiz over all of your Africa material. And then homework for Tuesday, April 21st, which is a week from tomorrow, is when your Africa map test will be. So I'm going to probably upload all of the PowerPoints that we starting before we ever went into our quarantine through this one, so that you have them all at your fingertips. Hopefully you've been taking notes, paying attention. Anything that I've said, videos that I've asked you to watch, I could ask you something on any of those. I'll try to make sure that they are big items, not just minor minuscule things that don't really matter. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to talk with you. And I think I got everybody's last test graded, but I'm still working through stuff, so I appreciate your patience. Doing lessons this way takes a lot more time than you can even imagine. I've never actually taught this lesson this way before. I had to create a new lesson, so it's just time consuming. So I appreciate your patience. We've only got 5 weeks of school left, so hang tough, enjoy your family, stay safe, pray that this scourge of coronavirus will be swept into the air, and that God will allow us to go back to the normal, and pray that we have a whole new appreciation for our freedoms. I think oftentimes how we would pray in the mornings at school about thanking God for the freedom to gather and go to a Christian school and to worship and all those things. And right now it feels like we don't have those freedoms. We do, just in a different way. And so I'm looking forward to going back to normal. I'm looking forward to a normal summer. I don't know if how long it will be for we're all not scared to death of germs. My hands are raw from washing them, but I'm looking forward to that. So when everything settles down, party at my house. We'll have a big cookout or something to celebrate the very weird 2020 coronavirus end of the school year. So love you guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.